Okay, so over the last few sessions, we've been mainly talking and focusing in on like technical skill sets and specifically looking at effects and how to use sound effects and then tying them a little bit kind of conceptually and narratively to how to move a story along. So I thought it'd be kind of nice today just to actually look at the other end of podcasting a little bit more and have a look at some of the roles that you have in maybe like a broader podcasting context. So in this case, you've got, for example, a large form podcast from, say, someone like Pineapple Studios. It's not necessarily just a one-man show. I know that a lot of what we've been talking about is kind of doing it yourself, and that means you're filling all these different roles we're going to talk about. But I think that it's important to kind of understand the actual hats that you're supposed to be wearing. So let's just have a little look. I'll run down some of the main roles. The first role we've got, which is kind of, I guess, the main hat you're wearing most of the time when you're working on your own podcast, is the project manager. So it's kind of your idea in terms of what the project actually is, and you're in charge of making sure that every other role manages itself in the right way. You're in charge of making sure that when people have organized interviews, they're all correlated and everything is cohesive. So it's kind of the most fundamental role, and it probably occupies most of your time. But again, it kind of encompasses all the other roles to one extent or another because you're almost sub-managing them. Then you've got the outreach manager. You can essentially think of this person, for example, if we were doing a more investigative journalism approach of a podcast. There was one I listened to the other day that had this huge bulk of research and ridiculous amounts of interviews from multiple people. And if you're wanting to have multiple interviews, especially from people that are more difficult to get to, people in government, people in higher up positions, it might be worthwhile having like an outreach manager. So these are basically people who send out emails or get in touch with potential interviewees that you want to work with, and they're in charge of following up. Because especially if you're looking for more, high up or harder to get to interviewees, you might need to be a bit more persistent, especially as a smaller podcast starting out. So I thought, while speaking about the outreach manager, there's also a few tools that are really useful. So you've got Persist IQ, Outreach. These are all like online kind of their email tools that you can add on. You've got Connector and you've got HubSpot Sales. And these are all essentially ways of sending repeat emails to a list of email addresses. For example, you might have a company, say Coca-Cola, and you're doing investigation surrounding Coca-Cola, and you want to speak to someone in the company, but you're not exactly specific to who, but you have a list of 15 emails that would all be useful. You can use this, like for example, Persist IQ, to send emails out to all 15 email addresses and time them to reoccur to say, hi, I'm following up again, hi, I'm following up again, up until the point that one person replies. And once that person replies, their name is taken out of the repeat email, and then it creates its own little email thread for you to follow. This can be really useful just to like stop you spending forever writing 101 emails back and forth. Then you've got, I guess, the show host, which in many cases is still the same person as the project manager, but potentially it's not. If you're doing a corporate type show, you might have a specific person who's actually hosting, if it's like a Q&A type podcast or an interview where you're hearing the person. And this person is often, well, like we said, the same person as the project manager. But something we can maybe talk about is actually the interviewing that they're doing. So as the host, which is very often yourself, you'll be physically interviewing the guests or the people that you want to bring on. And we haven't really talked that much about it. Obviously, in this case, with the podcast we've been working on, I'm the host in that case. I've been doing the interviews, but at the same time, I've been very careful to try and leave myself out. I've not used any of my own voice. It's been very much using my interviews as like an impulse to create content and get responses, and then cut those responses together to create a cohesive, singular piece of audio that doesn't involve these kind of question response, just from a stylistic thing of what I like and what I wanted to do. But if you were interviewing your interviewees, it's quite important or very nice to do a 15-minute short interview the day before or just before the interview. So we did this with Lisa, but we didn't do this with all of our interviews, and that's more down to specific circumstances that some people weren't available because of the nature of doing a podcast with a war zone, people are volunteering, their schedules and everything are really sporadic. So it might not always be possible, but especially for stuff that's a bit more controlled, it's not contingent on a million and one things, being able to do that is really helpful, because I think it also allows the interviewee that you're going to be interviewing to solidify and articulate their opinions. Like if you touch on a topic that you really want to talk about, like for example with Lisa, we had a little chat about the story of her essentially establishing this communication with her dad's bus company and this charity that was helping relocate Ukrainian refugees. By talking that through with her in a quick kind of like 15-20 minute pre-interview, it kind of solidified in her brain and made her be able to articulate it really succinctly and clearly. So yeah, it can be very useful. And here you can also kind of get details that you might not necessarily want physically recorded, but you would want to save, like for example, spellings and names, or just useful stuff that you could maybe include, for example, as a voiceover later. If you needed to include the information but didn't want to use their voice, you can have yourself doing a little introduction interview. You've already got all the information there. And that kind of brings into this idea of like point of view discovery. So point of view discovery is figuring out what your interviewee's goal is, how they view whatever their topic is. So if they're talking about, let's say, for example, what is happening in the music industry, you want to find out what their point of view on the music industry is, what they believe in, where is their kind of ethos surrounded. And part of that pre-interview is to very much figure that out, because it lets you develop a line of questioning for the actual interview that's relevant and directed, rather than having this kind of scattered approach. So it's kind of a few, like I did a little bit of research to find some of the most common POV discovery questions that people do in pre-interviews. And some of them are, for example, what is a commonly held belief in our industry that you passionately disagree with? And when I say our industry, that's kind of the generic replace with whatever podcasting or whatever topic of the podcast is. Or another one was what should everyone in our space stop doing, or what should everyone in our space start doing. And I think these can be really useful just to find, I guess, yeah, the opinion of your interview, and you kind of start to bring out the personality rather than just the pure knowledge of the personality. You can understand their biases, their interpretations, and use that to actually create their narrative and create the line of questioning that help furthers the podcast rather than repeats itself. Because especially if you're doing something on similar topics and you have multiple interviews, it can be very easy to repeat stuff. Like for example, this Ukraine podcast, we've tried very much to get people to specifically hone in on what they have been doing, because this avoids lots of overlap of people talking about the same sorts of things, but from a different angle. And it gives everyone their own distinct, unique feature to the segments. So from that, you've got the ability, once you've done that POV discovery, to create your default questions. And from there, you've got your kind of standard, the what's, why's, how's. And you kind of, based on the information you find in the POV, you can build this questionnaire of those the what's, why's, how's, to spin the kind of the right narrative based on your plan, based on what the subject of the podcast is supposed to be. So that all falls usually under the job of the host, which again is often the project manager, not the main person, but not always. Then you've got writer slash editor sort of person. So this person is specifically focused on the narrative element. It's not from any technical side of the podcast, but it's specifically just looking at how does everything piece together, what is unnecessary, what from these interviews that we have already prearranged with the audio editor who we'll talk about in a bit, what is not necessary, what is missing, what other interviews do we need to get to fill the gaps. But they will also work in terms of writing podcast descriptions or blog posts that promote the podcast, anything written physically rather than audio medium as well. Then you've got a voice of artist, which is again kind of optional. This is not, I would say every podcast has this, and it's definitely not required. You can often fill it yourself. All of these, I would say, you can be done by one person, and many podcasts are. But in terms of voiceover specialist, it might be to do specifically an introduction, and especially if you were doing some kind of corporate branding type podcast, you might have a voiceover specialist come record an intro sound, an intro dialogue for the podcast and use that as a recurring theme. But I would say this is probably one of the more minor roles. Then you've got the audio engineer. So this is something we've been focusing on a lot in these workshops. And that's mainly also because from a skill set, it's maybe the most alien. It's something that people rarely don't quite grasp from a natural level because it's using software that people don't even know which one is to use. And there's a lot of unknowns that can make it just a bit too daunting. And I would say it's maybe one of the biggest barriers of being able to create what you want, because without being able to physically put it together, no matter how good the other jobs are, it can't become what it's supposed to be. It can't be a podcast, it can't be released or be listened to. So yeah, the audio engineer's job, it's fairly broad arching, as you probably kind of already started to tell from the workshops. The main job is editing the audio, so taking the interviews, bringing them into software, cleaning them up, taking out ums and ahs, working with the writer editor and the project manager to build the narrative so that they're arranging parts in the way the person would like, creating the right sort of gaps and spaces. And again, it's very collaborative, that sort of approach, especially working in a team. When you're doing it yourself, obviously, it's just an extension of the other jobs and it more becomes a tool. But equally, like we've been doing, the audio engineer also is responsible for sound effects and track play, ambience, and also sourcing of sounds. So the audio engineer won't be, if it was a team, wouldn't be brought, here's a bunch of sounds. They might be brought a list of saying, yeah, these are things we've thought about that we really want. We want over this part of an interview, this. But generally speaking, the audio engineer will have to be pretty autonomous to source the sounds themselves, put them in, edit them, put the right sort of fades, all that kind of creative side, as well as effects. And then you've got mixing, which we've talked about again a bit before, but that's in terms of making sure everything's balanced, all the sounds are even, the voice doesn't jump around in volume too much, everything's audible. And then creating the delivery files. So making sure it's up to some standards, which we'll talk about later on as well. Making sure, potentially also exporting the different versions. So we'll talk a bit later on today about the idea that I have for the podcast we're currently working on, about how we can create it into sections, and basically everything involving both the audio software and the physical arrangement. That is the engineer's job. And then you've got some kind of more secondary jobs or jobs that are also often taken by the project manager, etc. So you've got like graphic designer, in terms of this is usually like a one-time sort of thing to create a cover art, to create a XYZ. And then you've got the administrator, which is essentially managing social media posts, managing distribution, doing all forms of admin, the most generalist job, I would say, out of the whole list. So in terms of being responsible for releasing a podcast, maybe that's something we should talk about now, and then we'll talk about it again at the end when we're physically going around doing it a bit more. But once you've finished your podcast, you have the physical audio file, it's maybe not necessarily clear how you actually take that audio file and get it to Spotify, to Google Play, to podcasts, etc. So what you need is a thing called a third-party host, and this is part of the administrator's job. Would be sending the audio file to a third-party host site. And what they do is they upload the podcast you have to all the different services at once. Some are paid for and some are free. So I've made a little list here of some of the best free ones, and I've got a few of the little statistics to give you an idea of them. But also, if you're looking at doing it, I would have a little browse around and see what works best specifically for you, because it really depends on what type of podcast, etc., you're wanting to do. But the 5 kind of top ones that I could find from a bit of my research, so there's one called Buzzsprout. So I'll just read off as well. I've written down a few of the statistics. You've got Buzzsprout, which gives you 250 gigabytes of bandwidth, which is the amount of data it can basically stream at once. So it's 250 gigs, you're limited to 2 hours worth of podcasting storage on it on the free version. It goes to all the major distributors, Apple, Google, Spotify. You can't monetize from it. So this is the main issue with all of these, that if you're planning on trying to monetize your podcast and make revenue from ads, etc., you will need to use a paid for host. But I guess that's okay, since in theory it should offset itself. And yes, Buzzsprout also provides analytics. So you can get all the viewer information, where they're from, how many are listening, the time that they're listening to, bits they're skipping, all these sort of things which can be really useful to help develop and further create more content. Then you've got Spreaker, which has unlimited bandwidth, 5 hours of storage, goes to all the main people, all the main services. You again can't monetize it, and it also has analytics. So all of these that I'm going to read out all submit to the main Google, Apple, Spotify. None of them monetize, and they are all provide analytics. You've also got Podbean. So that's 100 gigabytes of bandwidth and 5 hours. And then 2 of my favorite, which I think are really the best ones to look at. You've got Castos, which is totally unlimited bandwidth, totally unlimited storage, and Simplecast, which is also the same, totally unlimited bandwidth, totally unlimited storage. But yeah, we'll have a little more of an in-depth look once it comes to actually releasing the podcast, once we've finished things. But that gives a rough overview to the podcasting process and the roles contained within it. And if you've got any questions about that, you can send me an email or anything like that at all. So now we'll maybe have a little look at, but again, a bit more of a technical side, and then actually just a bit more physical examples, rather than me talking about concepts and ideas. Might be a little bit slower, a little bit less talking of me just actually working through the current podcast we have. And you'll see I've made a little list of some ideas, and you'll learn a little bit more, some kind of in-depth niche uses of the software. So let's just have a quick look now at the podcast where we're at. So if I go over to Reaper here, and I've made these markers, and I've just written on the little piece of paper what I want each marker. I just find that sometimes it's a bit easier. You can make notes inside of the markers. So for example, 15 is when we're starting from. Let's see what it is. I need to zoom out. 14. Oh, I seem to have lost all my. Yeah, they seem to have unfortunately actually disappeared because the software crashed earlier. But that is totally fine. I kind of have a rough idea in my head. So I know that over the section here of Dana was where I would really wanted to have a more immersive sound design. So we have this little silent drop-off that would work.
But still, those families or those groups, they will be locals.
And what I want to do in this section, which I really like the little city ambience, but I think it's important to add more hard sound effects. And what I mean by hard sound effects is something definable and specific. So the reason I classify this as ambience is it's a big accumulation of sounds that are not particularly distinct. Yes, you can hear people, you can hear, let me see what else is in that
groups, they will be locals.
Yeah, you can hear people talking, you can hear walking, you can hear clothes rattling, but there's no specific sound, for example, of I don't know, a car screeching or something that's incredibly definable and almost, I guess you could think of it as like the focal point of a shot. So I've also not quite thought of exactly what that is just yet, but maybe we'll have a little experiment around and see what we can add in. But just something to make it more immersive, because to me it's really nice having this ambience under his voice, but once it drops away, it just feels a bit empty, and it doesn't keep the pacing that I want. It kind of truncates it a bit. So I'm going to play it again, and then I'll have a little think, and probably head over to the BBC Archive site or something similar and see what free sounds we can pull.
2 hours maybe for a day or a weekend, but still those families or those groups, they will be locals.
Okay, so what I'm thinking in terms of narrative standpoint, I'm going to go onto the BBC Archive site and see, they might not have this, but I'm looking for the sound of potentially someone entering a coffee shop or entering a restaurant or something like that, just to reinforce the point of getting to know the city and also change it so it's not just pure background noise. And what we could, here we go, I found a coffee shop interior. This may be just slightly have a little look. I can't find any entry of shops, but what I can do, so you often won't be able to find the exact effects that you want, etc. But I found a restaurant here. I found a coffee shop. Let me see if I can find it. So I found a few, and I'm going to take the actual coffee shop interior, which is a bit more of an ambience, but to give it the effect that I'm wanting, with more of a hard effect, and remove the kind of the lack of definedness, if you will, of it. I'm going to also add the sound of a door opening, or some sound that I can get away with as being someone opening a shop door or opening a cafe door. And by layering them together, the brain won't actually know they're two separate audio files, so it can give the impression of this kind of change in scenery. There's a household cabinet, not a lot of doors. So this is shop. Not finding any doors, so I'm going to go to another site that's a little bit of hunting around. But I think it's kind of nice actually to see that not everything that you do is necessarily just a singular search. So I'm just going to have a look for copyright free door sound effects. And I'm just doing this on YouTube, and often if you type that in, you'll actually find the sounds of a bunch of different effects. See. A lot of them can be a bit hard to use because they can be a bit cheesy sounding, but yeah. So I'm just still having a little look through. There we go. Perfect. I found very, very stereotypical, exactly what I had in my head. So I'm just going to take that while that's downloading. Grab it. So also one of the reasons I'm doing this now is over the last week, so I've been having to think of the overall podcast and the kind of length it's going to be based on the fact we still have, I think, one other interview that we want to incorporate into it. And instead of making it 40 minutes, I'm thinking of potentially the way we're creating it is as a singular piece. And the plan is to have it as a singular piece, but potentially released in these kind of smaller parts. And we can do that by these transitions that we're creating. So when we switch between one interviewee and another, we tend to have some kind of ambience change. And what we can actually do is mute sections and export it in multiple parts when it comes later on the road once they're all finished. And they kind of become the self-contained little ideas, and they have their own, I guess, sonic fingerprint, because that's what I'm doing anyway, regardless of them being separate items or not. The goal is to create each person's world as a kind of immersive and fairly clear sonic image, so that, for example, maybe you can think of it in terminology of cinematography, that if you were filming an interview with one person, there might be a very specific camera aesthetic, very specific background, very specific ambience, mise en scène. Whereas then if you were to go and film a totally different person with a different story, there'll be, again, different cinematography, background, ambience, etc. This is the sonic version, which can be a bit trickier because you're actually having to create it. It's not about getting it at the capture, it's about creating it in post-production. But that in itself, I think, gives you a lot more freedom and a lot more play. So I'm just going to bring in here, I've just dragged in two things that I downloaded. So we've got this top one here, and this one I'm just going to read into coffee shop ambience, and we'll drop him in the little ambience folder, change the color just to keep on top of the organization. And now he's again he's in the ambience folder, so he's going to be routed to come out of ambience. And yeah, and then we've got this shop door open. So I'm just going to call it door opens, just because having too long a name can get very hard to see. I'm going to put the custom color again for organization to yellow, because he is what I consider a sound effect, because it's kind of a one-time, a hard effect. It's not just a general background noise. So I'm going to drag him here, and now I'm going to play this section again and have a look at arranging it to make sense.
Or a weekend, but still those families or those groups, they will be locals.
Okay, so I'm going to bring this back a little bit. So once he says locals, there's a few seconds, like a half a second, 1 second pause. I'm just going to have these little fades in as well. And I brought the volume down a little bit as well, so it's not too in your face, but it's definitely
or
audible.
Those groups, they will be locals.
Okay, I'm going to shorten the clip a little bit and have that fade out happen a little bit more, because that creaking to me is just a bit unnatural.
Locals.
Okay, so once that door happens, now I'm going to go down to the ambience section, and we have, if I zoom out, this is the coffee shop ambience. So I'm going to bring the coffee shop ambience all the way to where the door starts. And now, what's quite important when you're creating these like pseudo-realistic soundscapes, I guess, is in real soundscapes, but you're using multiple sources from different recordings, different things to make one cohesive real space, is to think about what physically happens to the sounds. For example, the plan is we're having this door sound, because this door sound is going to introduce the coffee shop ambience that comes in. And you need to actually think about what happens when you open the door. So when you open the door, you're creating a little gap of air, which is slowly getting bigger and bigger. And that gap is allowing sound to come through and hear you. So essentially, when you open the door, you're creating a small fade in of volume. So what I'm going to do is take the clip and cut it right where the door starts, just using the S. And then from here, I'm going to fade the sound all the way in over the kind of length of the door creaking, which is the length of the clip. So like this. And then we might want to tweak that shape, because if you essentially think of the way the door is being opened, it's actually very specific to the shape of the fade. They're kind of directly related. So let's have a play and see how natural that is. It might sound perfect, but it might still be a bit too close. Okay, so they're definitely far too loud. So I'm just going to bring that down quite a lot because it's also its ambience. It shouldn't be this all dominating sort of sound. And I'm also going to shorten it because we kind of want it to end roughly where the other sound ends. And again, we're going to do a bit of a fade out over that section. So let's have a listen to this now.
Those groups, they will be locals. I'm from a Hungarian family. We spoke Hungarian.
Okay, so I'm going to shorten these clips a little bit just because, again, they're interrupting his voice when he starts speaking with his voice.
I'm from a Hungarian family. We spoke Hungarian. My grandma is like a super Hungarian.
Okay, great. So to me, that just creates a little bit of interest, a little bit of diversity to that silent section, or the section where there's no speaking, sorry, not silent section. And I think that that fulfills the role of what I wanted to do here. So the next bit that I really wanted to have a look at was the transition between where Victor is talking about bomb shelters and the hope for the future. So I'm probably going to need to have a little bit of think, and you're going to see the mental process of coming up with ideas. But I think it is here.
Like some storage spaces for the residential buildings. I hope that the rumors about nuclear weapons, they will remain.
Okay, so I'm going to play a little bit earlier on so you can kind of get the context, but essentially Victor is talking about the poorly made bomb shelters and the still air raid sirens happening in Uzhhorod. And even though it's related, it's there definitely needs to be some sort of tone change from a narrative perspective, but also just a sonic palette perspective, because he then talks about his hopes, and he's talking about he hopes that there won't be any nuclear bombs, etc. So it's still in the same idea of danger and bombs, etc. But we need to kind of change the tonality from him talking about the current problems, which have more of a darker tone, to something that's slightly more hopeful. And I'm thinking maybe the best way to do this is with some sort of ambient drone. So some sort of like tone, not necessarily music, but just like a singular tone that undulates a little bit. And maybe transitions, we could even potentially have a slightly darker tone that comes in over this section where the bomb sirens are. And from that tone, we could potentially do a kind of crossfade so that the slightly more pleasant tone or less foreboding tone fades in while the other one fades out. So let's just have a look again. They might not be the best sound effects we find, but let's have a look for foreboding. I'm just again using the BBC archive to see what we can find. Yeah, and usually the things you want to look for are either drones or ambient sounds. But the problem, if you look for ambient sounds, it's going to be very likely ambience as well. So it might just take a little bit of searching here.
I've been editing all my videos for years and going into the studio and
so let's have a little let me have a look here and see what goes. I'm just going to keep looking again, but I'm looking between BBC Sound Archives, the Free Sound Bible, and then YouTube specifically for copyright free, because you can't necessarily use anything you find in the large sections of it are not free. So the problem I'm finding is when I'm looking for drones, I'm finding drones of bees, drones of different animals. Look for comedy effects. Okay, so we're going to try something that again kind of harks back to last episode, but a large part of creating a podcast is repeating the same thing in different ways. So I've found this very strange sound that might be able to be used as an impulse for a kind of a sound effect. So it's in its current form, I don't think we can use it really. So I'm just going to bring it into a new track. If I zoom back in and scroll down the session. And I think it's like someone playing a didgeridoo very aggressively. But I'm just going to bring it up here to the sound effects and we'll solo it again so you'll hear. It's very strange. And we've got this section here. Okay, so what I'm going to first start doing is see what happens if I drag it all the way out like we looked at last time. So I'm just time stretching it and then see. Okay, so that doesn't quite do, that's maybe a bit too much. So let me push it back and meet it in the middle. Okay, so I'm going to try this and then I'm going to go back in and add some effects to it, and I want to pitch it down. So I should have somewhere in here pitch octave down. And we'll pitch. So I'll have a look at this. Okay, so I'm kind of liking that general pitch down sound, and now I'm going to add again. I'm going to add some kind of maybe a reverb sort of sound. I don't think there's any reverb that comes on the JS standards. No, so we have to find that back in the Cuckoo stuff. I think it's called reverberate. It's one of the two. It's reverberate or reverb. I think it's reverberate. Yes. Okay, and then I'm going to add one more final thing, and let's have a listening context to what we want it as. We want it very much as a slow ambience, so we're definitely going to want to turn the volume down a lot. So I'm pulling it way down, doing a fade in like this, and a little fade out. And let's have a look at how this sounds in context.
First, even though
Oops,
designed the early Soviet period, and they're mainly just some warehouses or like some storage spaces for the residential buildings.
Yes, I'm just going to try stretching this around again by holding Alt and just see what different amounts.
Or like some storage spaces for the period, and they're mainly just some warehouses or like some storage spaces for the residential buildings.
Okay, and I'm actually going to try messing around with adding a second reverb, because to me the thing that I'm not enjoying is the pulsing of it. It needs to be a little bit more solid, and this is probably not ideal. I would have usually spent a bit more time hunting and troving through different archives, but I think it's useful for you to see if maybe you don't have the exact sound you want, the best way to get it. So I'm going to go back here and I'm going to maybe just put a second might even actually mess around with putting a delay. And the reason for this is if I make a delay that's subtle enough, it won't actually add to the pulsing. It will make it random enough that you don't notice the pulsing being too rhythmic. So what I'm doing here is doing a very small bit of feedback, which is the amount of the number of times something is looping within the delay.
Houses or like some storage spaces for the residential buildings. I hope houses or like some storage spaces for the residential buildings. I hope
so that does a little bit, and again, I'm just going to duplicate. I should be able to go copy selected effects, and I should just paste it there, and I can change the order here. So now you can see we've got the pitch octave, going to reverberate, going to delay, going to reverberate. And this is quite a lot of heavy processing. I wouldn't recommend it
mainly
all
just
the time.
some warehouses or like some storage spaces for the...
And I'm going to try even putting, and just to see how it sounds, because a large portion of this is messing around. I'm going to put a pitch down octave at the end of everything. And this is kind of more to actually almost break the processing and get it to see what weird sounds it comes up with.
Warehouses or like some storage spaces for the residential buildings.
Okay, so to me that's much closer to what I wanted in my head. So what I'm going to do is I'm kind of happy with this as a sound. So you can right click. This is, remember, this is the clip-based effects. So this is not the same effects that you find if I go like this on the mixer, like these effects here, or these ones. This is specific to the clip. So this is specifically being applied just to that clip. And it's because there's quite a lot of processing going on here, especially if you have a lot of this happening all throughout a long, say an hour-long podcast. Your computer is really going to start to feel like you're going to maybe get jumps and glitches and pops, and it's just going to make working a bit more annoying. So a good practice to do, which I like to do, is to freeze the tracks. So I should be able to, if I select all of these plugins, I should be able to one second, I was going to find the find the right bit to commit it. It seems actually it's not letting me commit it without just freezing the channel. So I should be able to, yeah. So I should be able to now, from this track, instead of going right click like this, I can close here, and I can go find it again. I've managed to lose it. Render / freeze tracks, and we want this in a stereo stem. And the reason I want this in a stereo stem is because with the reverbs, we're actually adding stereo information that I think helps to create the overall spatialization, also the grandeur of the sound. And also because Victor's voice is in the center, like we talked about before, it means that by having that stereo image and the slight differences, it's actually going to create more separation and clarity, even though there's more physical information, there's more audio. So I'm just going to render the tracks here to a stereo stem and mute original. So what this does is it's going to come with this little window, and it's taking the effects we have. And those effects will be printed by the computer, no longer being processed. You can't edit them. So you should only do this once you're kind of happy with them. You can go back and edit them on the original tracks. But for me, I'm kind of fairly confident I don't want to go back and edit this. I like what's happened. The original sound definitely wasn't the right sort of sound. So I'm going to do this little render, and then it creates an analysis file. And now what I can do is I can delete this track here. So before I do, actually, I'm just going to check this and make sure it plays. There you go. You can see this. There you go. So what I'm going to do is delete this track, so remove track. And I'm going to rename this to low drone. So we kind of know and this will go into ambience. Now, there's kind of an argument that maybe we could actually put it in music, and I guess this really depends on how you want to think about it. I think maybe actually we're better putting it in music right now, and I'm thinking about this from an archiving standpoint, that if I wanted to create an ambient stem, I wouldn't necessarily want this to be in the ambient stem, if that makes sense. I would want, one second, I managed to drag this the wrong way around. Second. Oh, to mix these all up. Take this out of the load drone. There we go. I'm going to take this out. So I'm just clicking the track and dragging to the left. Sometimes it seems to be a little bit difficult. It doesn't seem to let me want to do it right now. I think because how small my icons are. So I'm just going to extend the icon. I might need to drag it here. There. So the door closed is also currently not in the right folder. So I'm going to drag the door closed into here, and then you can go all the way to the bottom. Like that. And then we have music here. I'm going to drag music down to here. And if I click this little button, it'll actually folder the low drone. And then I can, oh, no, it's not that. No, I can just take reverb and put it. I'll actually keep it where it is for now. I'm just going to pick a color for music. And now I usually use purple, so we'll see the purple colors. I'm not sure the exact colors within reverb because I'm usually on different software. But let's have a look at that. Yeah, that looks fairly distinct. I can easily tell what's my music now. And again, you can see here, it's rendered this full file with a really long section, which is totally unnecessary. You can actually see in the pre-made waveform at the top that there is only 10 seconds, 5 seconds of this. So I'm just going to clear up the rest more from a visual standpoint. Technically, there's no audio there. It's not doing any processing. But it just means when you're going back around and navigating the project that you don't have to find and remember what is the time code the sound effect actually happens in, etc. So we've got that little low drone now. Let's see how it blends in with these. You've got the air raid sign going into the low drone, and then we're going to need to think of another creative way of sound designing. And then think a bit more conceptually about how to create a more of a hopeful tone using something that's just like a singular sound. And then we're going to look at crossfading them together and creating a blend so that you get a kind of narrative shift from a subconscious level that predicts this next section we'll go into.
Because those bomb shelters were designed in the early Soviet period, and they're mainly just some warehouses or like some storage spaces for the residential buildings.
Okay, perfect.
I hope that the rumors about nuclear weapons.
So one thing that we can try to do, which might not work, I'm not convinced, but I'm going to try it anyway, and it'll be a good way to show some of the tools we can do, is if I duplicate this track here, and I create, one second, and I drag this one along so that halfway through, so we'd want it to kind of come halfway through the silence almost, or maybe starting just after the silence, actually thinking about it, like this. And we create a fade in, and here we create a fade out. We could potentially just look at using the pitch shift effects. If we double click again and bring up the media item properties menu and go back to take effects, we can look at the different pitch options. So we used this repitch from Cuckoos. Let's have a look what happens under the JS options. We have pitch an octave down, pitch an octave up, pitch down shifter, pitch shifter 2. So let's see what pitch shifter 2 is. We might want pitch octave up, because my plan is to then take the exact same sound and just modulate it up a little bit, so that you're getting a kind of slightly more hopeful. Still, it shouldn't be too happy or too clear, but just have a slight kind of hopeful tone, etc. So let me have a little play. Have a see. We can adjust in sense. So we can adjust in sense, semitone, and octaves. So this is up 1 octave. Okay, so what I'm going to do is put these together. This is probably not as sweet a sound as I would like, but again, we'll see what we can do from a kind of post-production standpoint and just try work with what we have, because again, you might not always be able to have the best audio quality or the right samples, and it's maybe better to know how to manipulate them to get what you want. So let me add in a reverb. So we go back. Oh, it's not reverb, it's verb, isn't it? So we go to cuckoos. Yeah, and we've got reverberate, and let's use the other reverb just because we want to have a different sound. We've already used two of the other ones. And let's bring in a sweet verb and see what this does to that sound.
The residential buildings.
So it's coming in now. Okay, so that's one. Oh, that's the wrong sound actually, sorry. Yeah, this is the sound. Let's listen to them together when they transition. Okay, it's getting closer. Let's see what the other bad crunch version is, and a lot of this is just messing around. It's really just creative play. Okay, so this is getting a bit closer. It is very foreboding, but the topic he is going to does have a foreboding element, so it's not totally outside of the narrative arch or anything. So let's have a little play here now in context with the section 4 and just see what more work it needs.
That something will go wrong. We still have the sirens, we still go to those bomb shelters, even though they are not super safe, because those bomb shelters were designed in the early Soviet period, and they're mainly just some warehouses or like some storage spaces for the residential buildings. I hope that the rumors about nuclear weapons, they will remain rumors, because I hope that the rumors about...
Okay, so now the one thing I'm going to look to layer over this, because I think it might be easier to find than any of the drones we want, and we can again use it as an impulse, just to take away some of the kind of maybe horror tropism of that, because I don't want it to be too over the top. I'm going to look on the BBC sound effects, first of all, for a major chord. Now, I'm not going to necessarily try and get into any kind of musical theory or anything like that, but the most basic that I'll just kind of leave it at is that major chords tend to sound happy, minor chords tend to sound sad. And I'm thinking if I can find a major chord sample, I can use that to help just change the tonality of the ambience a bit. And again, I'll probably process it really heavily like we've seen, so it doesn't necessarily sound like a major chord sample. And yes, I'm kind of showing this from a very limited sample. I'm trying to only use, or I am only using open source things, etc. If this was my own production exclusively, I was working my own software, I would potentially look at using some virtual instruments, etc. But at the moment, I think it's better, rather than trying to delve into kind of more niche things like composition, which are an entire course or something in their own, it's better to just look and focus in on doing these, which also help refine your skills as an audio editor, and also how you think about the podcast. Because I think if there's too much for you to start thinking about, you can end up doing 101 things, but not really knowing the best way to focus on any of them. So let me just, I'm having a little browse still to find on free sound. And you'll usually find these kind of different websites, Free Soundbite or BBC Soundbites, YouTube Copyright. They all have their own best things, and I would say BBC Soundbites is very good for any sort of historical, realistic things. but for example, freesound.org usually has better weird droney sounds or like experimental things. So I've got an effects drone here. Okay, so I've found a fairly nice little drone. And in fact, what's really nice about the website is they also tell you, so this is freesound.org, they tell you what it came from. So here, this one we're downloading says kids in the pool after a few sound effects. So I'm going to also download another one that says drone ambience A. Well, actually, I've got one. Yeah, this is drone sound, which they say is a pitch down microwave. So you do need to make an account to be able to download stuff, but it's free to have an account. I've got one. So I've just logged in. I'm just downloading one and downloading two. And I'm going to bring them in now. And we'll compare them to the current sounds we have and see how we can maybe incorporate both of them, or whether we need to be brutal and decide between them. But it's better to have more options than less when it comes to creating kind of unique and interesting sound lays. So you can see we have this track here, and I'm gonna call one sweet drone and one sour drone. So this one's the sweet drone. And we want to use this one to transition to the kind of narrative point we was talking about as hopes for the future. And then we have this other one, which is like a sour drone, and it's kind of a low, so it's sour drone, just to distinguish themselves. And again, I'm going to color them the same colors as the music section. We're keeping this music more for a post-production archival purpose than anything else. So I'm going to do the same thing as the other one, cut the low sour drone, do the fade out over this section, and then the sweet drone, bring it in, do a little fade over here, 2 seconds. And then let me just do a quick fade out over here. So let me just test how this sounds. Okay, so I'm going to extend the actual fade and make it a really slow fade, and bring the volume of it just down a little bit as well, because it's very loud. So try that. Okay, so this is much closer already. Now let's see, compare that to what we originally had. So this is our own sound design. Okay, and now what we're going to do is layer them together, and let's see what all four are. Um, 2 minutes. Okay, perfect. So now we've kind of used the sound design to build up the idea. What we'll do is maybe take a little 20-minute break, 15-minute break, and I'll come back around, say, 12:45-ish, and we'll resume and have a look at finishing off and adding in more of these kind of sound effects and incorporating this with some fades, etc., to make it solid. Perfect. Okay, so where we left off just before the break was we'd made this kind of drone transition between the two sections. So what I'm just going to do now is unsolder them, and we're going to have a little playthrough and hear how this transitions from the bomb siren all the way through to the next section.
Thanks for joining us.
Oh, sorry, I need to mute. I dragged in some clips, which I'm going to be talking about in a little minute over the break. Okay, here we go.
That something will go wrong. We still have the sirens. We still go to those bomb shelters, even though they are not super safe, because those bomb shelters were designed in the early Soviet period, and they're mainly just some warehouses or like some storage spaces for the residential buildings. I hope that the rumors about nuclear weapons, they will remain rumors, because
okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just adjust the blend of this now. I quite like what's happening. I just think that the ratio of volumes, etc., could be a bit better. So I'm just adjusting them on the clip here. Applying it, and adjusting some of the fades, etc. And then the final thing I'm going to do, just to help ease this all over, is I'm going to insert a new track. And I'm putting this track here. And then below this, I should be able to, one sec, it appears to give me a little, he doesn't seem to want to let me, so it's been a bit tricky. Normally, you should just be able to, just a bit of finessing. And I'm going to call this drones. The reason I'm doing this is because I want to apply multiple effects. Sorry, not multiple, I want to apply a singular effect to the whole group of these. So what I'm going to do is close this here, and open up the drones track a bit fatter. And then in the mixer view, I'm going to take the drones track, and I want to send, so remember we can do a little quick shortcut to the reverb track, just like this. And I'm just going to bring it down to 0 like this right now. And close it. And now you can see the reverb exists there. So now I can close the mixer view again with just Command N. And inside of this trim section, I can add the reverb send volume. And here you get this little volume envelope. And I'm just going to do a little automation run. Just at the end, we have the kind of tail of the sounds kind of extended, and it should let me. Just doesn't seem to want to on the side. There we go. Insert point, and I'm just going to insert another point. I'll drag that all the way down. This, and then here we should be able to fade mainly just the last bit out. So I'm just going to take this and here. It's not like me. Yeah, and just this last little section. Let's see how this sounds. So we want to bring it just like my. I'd go maybe here -20, something like this, and then I'm just going to insert one final more point and just bring it all the way down at the end, because we don't need it. So let's see if this sounds.
The rumors about nuclear weapons, they will remain.
It's a little bit quiet, a little bit short-lived, I think.
I hope that the rumors about nuclear weapons, they will remain rumors, because
I'm going to do this actually.
I hope that the rumors about nuclear weapons, they will remain rumors,
Okay.
because
There we go. That's much closer. So now we can just do is close the trim, make it invisible, and got all that nice automation packed in here with the drone tracks, nice and neat, nice and tidy. So I'm just going to collapse this down a little bit, close the music, and now I'm going to look at the next section, which is a little bit nice. It kind of incorporates some sound design elements, but with a narrative point and a factual kind of more journalism aspect as well. So what I've done is there's a section here in outside of inside Danik's interviews. Let me just zoom out. So up here, there's a section where Danik is talking about the Western media talking about the Ukrainian war before it happens. And I think a nice thing, both from a immersive contextual context, but also just a factual context to kind of reinforce that what he's saying is correct in this sense. I've downloaded a bunch of news reports, and I wanted to do a little rapid kind of collage of them saying some headlines when he references that. So let me just find it somewhere in here.
European kind of highway, BMPs, 2 or 3 months, the articles from Western
There we
intelligence.
go. So it's around about here. So I'll just play a little section of this.
So
2 minutes. Yeah.
the historical concept of their country from Kiev and Rus. So actually the name,
Sorry, no, further ahead.
number of Russian tanks.
Further back.
So they
There we go.
stole our history, and Kiev was founded like 700 years before Moscow. So that's the main case in Putin's head. And before the war, it was kind of 2 or 3 months, the articles from Western intelligence that like Russia is planning the invasion of Ukraine. But the problem is that the Western intelligences have been like counting just the number.
So here, so we're gonna do this. Oops, sorry, not just S. And at this point,
So they stole our history
from here,
2 or 3 months, the articles from Western intelligence that like Russia is planning the invasion of Ukraine.
so
But
at this
the
point here, we want to insert a little gap. So first thing I'm going to do is before we insert this gap, I've just made a marker here. I'm just going to put it marker 15. And I'm going to go over now to these. So we have these 3 news reports. And at the beginning is the main bits I want, but we might end up grabbing a few bits from the others. So we have this.
US about Russian intentions in Ukraine. We have no plans to invade. That was the message from Russia's foreign minister after talks with the US about Russian intentions in Ukraine. His American counterpart.
Okay, so Russian.
After talks with the US about Russian intentions in Ukraine. His American counterpart said their discussions in Geneva had been frank and substantive, but also warned of massive consequences if Moscow were to attack Ukraine.
Okay, so let's see just this little section for now.
Russian intentions in Ukraine. Russian intentions. US about Russian intentions in Ukraine. About Russian intentions in Ukraine. Russian intentions in Ukraine.
So we got that as a little snippet, a little soundbite. Then we have here this one.
The U.S. is exposing an alleged Russian disinformation plot to use as a pretext for an invasion of Ukraine. Senior administration officials say they as a pretext for an invasion. As a pretext for use as a pretext.
So we want from as, and here, I'm just going to take these away. And then we have this final one here.
Hello and welcome to the programme. First, the British government has issued its strongest warning so far about a possible Russian invasion of Ukraine.
There we go. How we want this one.
First, the British government has issued its strongest warning so far about a
Okay, so between these 3, now I'm going to just arrange them in a little sequence. So I think maybe having a slightly longer one and then a slightly shorter one like this. So the longest one's in the middle sandwich. I'm just going to solo again and have a listen. So
as a pretext for an invasion of Ukraine.
The British government has issued its strongest warning so far about a possible Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Russian intentions in Ukraine.
okay, perfect. So I'm just going to take away that breath, and that's exactly how I wanted this to sound. So I'm just going to select all of them. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring them up here just for ease of working. So I'm going to select all 3 channels and go all the way up here and drag them here. And then we want these to be kind of further down, somewhere by Danny, talking about, I think it's 14, marker number 14, 15, sorry, 15. I'm going to put them here. So now what I want to do is add the amount of time that these add, because obviously remember we've mentioned before that you always want to work left to right, because otherwise you end up ramming into things that are already there, or you have to move it all. So when I said that there is one way that you can get around this, and it's the best way, but it's still not ideal. But in this case, yeah, having now listened back to it, I wanted some transitions and also just to add some more meat, to create more dynamics and interplay between the characters, the sound effects, and create more of an immersive world in general. So in this section, we now want to include this much from here all the way to here of audio that wasn't accounted for. So we need to move everything, and that's not just the audio. If, for example, like we've already written bits of automation, we want to have all of that moved as well. So you can't just do that by dragging everything before, like you might think. It looks fine, and then you go around to actually doing it, and it becomes a mess. So what I do is you can select from here, and if you select the amount of time you want, so the reason I brought these here, so I can do a little drag from here all the way to here. And now what I can do is just right click on the ruler and go, find this, insert empty space at selection. So it's done this. And now all I need to do is grab these little sections again and just drag them all the way back. Yeah. There we go. And now we should have a nice, happy little comp. We just need to put some fades in or something potentially, but let's have a listen.
From Western intelligence that like Russia is planning the invasion of Ukraine.
As a pretext for an invasion of Ukraine.
The British government has issued its strongest warning so far about a possible Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Russian intentions in Ukraine.
But the problem is that the Western...
Okay, so it's still got a little bit too much time. I really, especially at this end bit, I want to have a nice pause. I want to have a second of silence. And potentially, if there's a breath here.
Ukraine.
But the problem is...
Okay, so I want to add at least something like this much time. And the way to do that, just drag and go. Insert. Okay. Insert empty space in selection. And you can see we've cut that off, so I'm just going to bring that further ahead a little bit.
Russian intentions in Ukraine.
And actually, I'm going to shorten it even more because
Russian intentions in Ukraine.
We've taken the N away. It's a subtle game of tweets here. Let's try again.
Ukraine.
Russian intentions in Ukraine.
But the problem is that the Western intelligences have been like counting just the number of tanks.
Okay. Okay, now let's check the entry point to it, because again, we are doing a very hard change, and these are nice because they create very stylistic things, and they're very intentional. You can see when you're a listener that it has direct intention. It kind of imparts itself to the piece. But we also need to make sure, because they're so sparse and direct, they need to be natural in a way.
Russia is planning the invasion of Ukraine.
As a pretext for an invasion of Ukraine.
The British government has issued its strongest warning so far about a possible Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Russian intentions in Ukraine.
But the problem is that the Western intelligences...
Okay, so what I'm going to also do is I'm just going to put a marker here for a later date. We won't necessarily look at it in this very second. But I want to call this, I'm just going to literally write maybe I think that's how you spell star. And this is just a note for myself that if later on when I'm scrolling through Danny's interview and I find a place where he sighs or takes like a concerned breath, something like that, I remember, oh yeah, this place actually would be really nice to have that silence, then a little breath to transition us in. But that is a really useful way of adding time. But before we go into more bits, let's just have a little look at some of the other things you can do. So I'm just going to do a save as quickly. This is also a really good thing. I think I've mentioned it before, but I'll mention it again. To always do a save as when you're doing anything to be honest, I would normally do it every day, at least once or twice a day, so that you can always revisit an older version if there's something preferred or there's something that you wanted to change. So now, for example, maybe maybe we decided after this, just for an example, that we didn't want this one here. And we actually want it to be shorter. What you can do is select the time, for example, like this, and right click. And then you can do, let me just find where it is. Yep, remove contents of selection, moving items later. And by doing that, everything moves. And it's not just the things that you see in Vision, but everything to the right of it. So I'm just going to undo that again, and you see it all jumps back. That is really, really useful as an editing tool for when you come to exactly this, that you want to add stuff in that you didn't think about later, because that always happens. So we have that in terms of this, I think we can call them time-based manipulations. And before we go on and look at adding some more effects, such as this clip, that I'd like to drop in and just keep adding a layer into the story, I'll quickly talk about something we've not mentioned, but is quite important. The ruler. So you've probably noticed up at the top there's a bunch of numbers whenever we're working, and our cursor moves along it.
A huge amount of people.
And so we call this the timeline, because it's left to right, it goes from time 0 to the front. And you can select different metrics, because the software Reaper is not only used for podcasting, it's used for music, a bunch of other different things. You have the option of beats and bars, which is a musical kind of reference point. But what we're actually more interested in, so we're going to put it in now so you can see, is the seconds, minutes and seconds, because podcasts are listened to in minutes and seconds. There's no regular timing. This is just the kind of standard way. So what you do is you can right click on the ruler up at the top, and you see this little drop down. And right now there's a tick next to measures.beats. And just simply you just click to minutes, seconds. You might want hours, minutes, seconds, frames, which is more for movies, but minutes and seconds is probably the best for you as a podcaster, especially if you're not super familiar with simply timecode, which is that format. This is just more straightforward and easy. Now, what I'm going to do as well is just give you an example of some useful things you might want to do. So I'm going to bring the cursor all the way to the front, and I'm going to insert a bunch of times. I'm going to insert, let's insert 30 seconds of time roughly. So I select 30 seconds, I right click, and I go insert empty space in selection. So say if we'd written our podcast like this, and we actually wanted to know the length of it, the exact length. What you can do is bring the cursor here to the very beginning. I'm just going to drag it to the very, very beginning. And we can right click. And let me just remember exactly, oh, sorry, not right click. So bring the cursor to the very beginning of the podcast, and you go to project settings, which is this little eye here. Click it, and you should get this section. So from within here, you have the option to select project start time. And you can change the start time to current episode. So you set 000 to where the cursor is, which means 0 seconds, 0 minutes, 0 everything at this point. And it means everything before that becomes negative time. So if I do that, you'll now see this is 0, and everything to the left of it is -1, -2, -10. And if you look, it counts all the way ahead normally. And this is useful because, for example, you might want to leave a bit of a gap so that you know, I need to bring in the intro music or the introduction that I've pre-made, but I don't want to bring it in yet. And I know it's 1 minute long, so I'm going to add 1 minute, but I'm going to work from 0 to 0 so that I can always reference where it actually starts and the actual time if I was to do an export, for example, to reference it later on. So it's really useful, super functional, and yeah, I don't necessarily use it all the time, but it's definitely worthwhile knowing about. And knowing you can also set it to any other place. So I'm just going to undo this now because we've actually at the right point, and I'm going to have to reset it. One second. I'm going to reset the cursor all the way to the beginning. There we go. And I'm just going to go back to project settings and here change start time, set 000 to current editor position. Or we could have done reset in that case. Both would have worked. And hit OK. And within here, actually, while we're open, just because I've thought of it, here you can actually change the, I think we mentioned it before, the different algorithms of time stretching. here you have the different pitch shifts algorithms and pitch shifter parameters, stretch markers as well. So they're all the different ways it looks at it. So you have balanced, tonal optimized, transient optimized, no pre-echo reduction. They're a bit complicated to go into now. Balanced is probably one of the most useful, but the other one you might be interested in would be tonal optimized potentially. So that kind of sums up the beats bars versus seconds concept and how you can, the actual functional use for being able to add in parts that you only thought about later after having built your narrative, put all your automation in, etc.
Ukraine.
So let's have a little listen to this.
2 or 3 months the articles from Western intelligence that like Russia is planning the invasion of Ukraine.
As a pretext for an invasion of Ukraine.
The British government has issued its strongest warning so far about a possible Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Russian intentions in Ukraine.
But the problem is that the Western intelligences have been like counting just the number of tanks.
Okay. So now the other thing, it's a very simple thing, I've already downloaded it and brought it in, is the little car driving sound effect. Actually, before we move in, I'm going to categorize these. Now, I think that there's a few ways we could put these into folders. It's definitely not ambience. It could be considered into speech, or it could be considered sound effects. So I'm going to maybe put it, I think in my mind, in speech, but in their own subfolder. So I'm going to go insert a new track. And here, I'm going to drag this in here and then put these inside of it. So you can see that little gray bar can be a bit finicky there. And I'm just going to call this sound bites. And the reason I'm putting it into speech is because at the end of the day, the functional role of the information, why those sound effects are there, are very much for a speech aspect. We care about what they're saying, not about the tonality of their voice as much. It's more the community, the information communication method is through words, not through sounds. So I'm just keeping them there, but when we come to export stuff, we might want to bring them out to their own channel, etc. So I'm just going to color them, and I'm going to give them a bit of a different color. So it'll still be within the blues, but because I want to remember they're a bit different, I'll maybe use some kind of bluey greeny thing like this, just so I can easily distinguish them, and they are there. So the next bit we'll do is dragging the car driving effect, and I wanted this over where Danik was speaking, because I was focusing in on Danik's sound effects as well, because he's very sparse at the moment. We have quite a nice selection and a fairly immersive environment for Victor, but for Danik, it's very much we just had some intro music, and I think that in order to make these stories more vibrant, more realistic, more immersive, it's just important to have all of this around. So in the ambience, I've got this car driving effect, and it's somewhere where he's talking about the volunteers.
151. That was like from the beginning.
It's near the beginning.
I'd say there was like absolute madness.
A bit further after here.
When I have been doing the electronic music parties, the guys just decided to make a volunteers base. That was like in the first days of this war. There was a lot of saboteurs in all over Ukraine and in Lviv also. So we decided to do the Molotov cocktails in those bases, and I was kind of a driver. I have been taking.
Okay, so when he says driver, I wanted just to incorporate this effect, just to again recreate the narrative, help like solidify the world that it's in, etc.
And in Lviv also. So we decided to do the Molotov cocktails in those bases, and I was kind of a driver. I have been taking these Molotov cocktails and delivering it to the checkpoints in Lviv. That was like the third day of the war. Actually, like more than a half of electronic music scene in Lviv are based in Zavodska Street. And when the war begins, like all of the spaces in Zavodska Street just began to work as volunteer spaces. In Club 151, that was like from the beginning, there was the Molotov cocktails production, but when...
So I'm going to test this again, I'm just making the fader. I quite like the kind of background noise of the car. It just helps again create interesting new dynamics, and it kind of keeps the listener's eye, in my opinion, or ear, if you will, because the voice can get very monotonous, especially if there's nothing else breaking it up. So by introducing these effects that are very different and then taking them away, to me, it just creates this very immersive environment.
Molotov cocktails in those bays, and I was kind of a driver. I have been taking these Molotov cocktails and delivering it to the checkpoints in Lviv. That was like the third day of the war. Actually, like more than a half of electronic music scene in Lviv are based in Zavodska Street. And when
I have another mark here from last time about adding driving, so we might just use the same
the main
one.
profile is receiving supplies, like the main profile is receiving supplies and resending them to Ukraine, because Lviv is kind of a logistics hub.
So what we'll do is we're going to take away that accelerator, because we don't want, again, you don't want to necessarily have anyone identify you use the same sample. So what I'm going to do is use the second half of this, which is just driving ambience. I'm just going to fade it out and fade it in quite a lot. Let's see how this works.
Of the war, making there the military trainings. Like the main profile is receiving supplies and resending them to Ukraine, because Lviv is kind of a that was like first maybe 7 days, maybe first week. I've been kind of a driver behind the volunteers bases in Lviv.
Okay, so now we have two other bits that I really wanted to add sound for. So Danik describes what war feels like, and he describes these burning tanks, and I think it might be a bit straightforward, but it's also kind of important in my eyes to have the sound of burning, whether it's just fire or actually burning vehicles, depends on what we can find. So I'm going to go first to the BBC sound out there, because for this sort of sounds, I think it's probably one of the best. It's the most likely to have an actual burning tank, because they have a lot of World War II footage. We have a household fire, a fire close up burning, oil refinery. Let's see. Still just having a little look at different burning sounds. Okay, so I think what might be best to create both the closest sound to what I had in my head and also create kind of a unique sound, I'm going to combine two. I have a coal mining with coal burning in a crate. And then we've actually got kind of household fire. Just weighing up. Okay, I'm just going to download both of these and I'll bring them in 2 seconds now. So there we go. I have them over here. I'm just going to drag them into Reaper. So I'm also just going to find where we want
weapons with dead bodies. Actually, like in Lviv, we just had maybe 3 with dead with that Z letter.
Here we go. This is me talking about
Way
burning
from
tanks.
Kiev to Lviv. The highway nearby Kiev was captured by Russians for 2 weeks, and I've seen the pictures from it. Just that Russian tanks with that Z letter. What was like?
Okay, so the main sound that I think the basis of this is that coal fire, which is this sound, which is the kind of more, I think, realistic sound. This other sound is just incredibly loud, so I'm going to first start off by trimming it a lot. Let's see how it sounds. What I'm going to do is cut sections of it, like this, and I'm just going to do slow fades, because in my opinion, what I'm doing, maybe from a conceptual visual standpoint, is the idea of him telling the story while walking around the area. So these things that I'm creating little fades are where there's maybe slightly more burning patches, etc. And we'll see how it works. This is also a way of incorporating maybe a sound that I don't think is as realistic or indicative as I'd like it to be, but I think it's the other one can be a bit static. So let's have a listen. Let's actually have a listen in context and see.
Way nearby Kyiv was captured by Russians for 2 weeks, and I've seen the pictures from it, just dead Russian tanks with that Z letter.
So I'm going to bring, wait, it says dead Russian tanks, we'll bring this in.
Tanks with that Z letter. What was like shocking for me the most? For me, war, it was like, you know, some kind of dirty stuff with everything is destroyed, you know, the pictures of absolute destruction. But you're riding on a good, like, European kind of highway. Everything is nice and good, just that's like absolutely destroyed gas station.
Okay, so I'm going to I'm going to delete this and fade out this little section. And then these are a little bit loud, and I've already turned them down a lot on the clip gain. So I'm actually going to resort to turn them down on the volume fader here. Maybe around 4 dB, 5 dB. Let's see how that sounds.
That Russian tanks with that Z letter. What was like shocking for me the most? For me, war, it was like, you know, some kind of dirty stuff with everything is destroyed, you know, the pictures of absolute destruction. But you're riding on a good, like, European kind of highway.
And then when he says riding, I'm going to reintroduce the sound we had from before to reestablish the. So I was going to also call them Fire 2 and Fire 1. And then within the sound effects, we have the driving, car driving. Within ambience, sorry. And I'm just going to zoom out, grab a little section of car, paste it in, extend it across, and then we'll tweak it to where it needs to be.
Dead Russian tanks and just like absolutely
So cut it here. That'll be 2 minutes. This, let's see.
But you're riding on a good.
Okay, here. So when he says riding, I kind of want the sound effect to fade up. Listen. This.
You know, the pictures of absolute destruction. But you're riding on a good, like, European kind of highway. Everything is nice and good, just dead Russian tanks and just like absolutely destroyed gas stations. That was so strange for me. It looks like you're driving the Europe, developed country, but you see some dead Russian tanks, BMPs. It was so strange to see, but it's rather.
Okay, perfect. So that's a nice little endpoint of that sound effect, and then you're getting this interaction of multiple sound effects, multiple ambiances. Now in my head, I'm going to put the fire here inside of sound effects, just because of the way I'm thinking about it in terms of its like functional roles, but it's a bit subjective. You could maybe put it in ambience if you would like as well. So we've laid quite a few nice sound effects. Before today, we didn't have this little news report section. We didn't have any of these sound effects. We didn't have any of this car section. All that Danik had was this electronic music transition. And it would be nice, I think, later on to incorporate some more musical elements, some more kind of electronic club stuff if we can. But again, you kind of need to let the project actually lead itself, and you might find that there's a perfect opportunity for it, or it might just be a nice idea that we don't get around to because it doesn't quite gel. And I think it's kind of nice to have that approach because it means you're not trying to force things that aren't working just because you would like them to, especially with sound, because there's kind of so many possibilities when you're pseudo recreating stuff. It can be very easy to have a definitive idea and go, I really want it to be like this. And actually, in practice, it doesn't work like that, or it's not actually. It might sound good, but it's not contributing to the narrative or the overall concept. So that's kind of the main bulk of it. I think there's one more sound effect I really wanted to add to Danik's section. It was kind of a somber, like an ambient dark drone that we can bring in back into the music. So I'm going to look. I think there was another one that I found. on this, I think it's freesound.org. So I'm going to go back here and have a look at drones. And I'm wanting to use this over the section he's talking about the kind of sights he's seen of war, just to help reinforce and create sonic narrative movement that matches his own information. So we've got, let's see. I'm just having a hunt through some different drones. Okay, so I've got one here. Might be a little bit cheesy again, but we're going to download it and see what we can do. And then I've got this, I think I have the other one. I think we already have that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in two and see how this works. And bring, we have this one here, which is a kind of, it's called Space Window, and I got it through freesound.org. And let me also just find the section that it's supposed to be over, because I think it's here.
Every city has kind of its own profile. I've seen the dead bodies. I've seen all of this massacre, which...
Okay, over this section, 18 is this like that.
We have been in a lot of cities. Every city has kind of its own profile. I've seen the dead bodies. I've seen all of this massacre which Russians made in the Kiev region, in Bucha, Irpin, just injured cities, like all buildings have been destroyed. I've been maybe like in 10 cities in this trip, supporting journalists, fixing for them like all of interviews with, for example, people who lost their homes and how they're...
Okay, so I brought this in. It's maybe a bit too high pitched, so we might use the pitch down, or we might layer it with, there was another drone here. So if I open up these, second, I'm just going to do this, and here. So within this, I think under the sour drone, it was called, if I remember it's correct, that was the microwave being pitched down. Yeah, this. So I think if we maybe add these two together and create this layer, we might have a nice little kind of sound design section that has the weight we want it to.
We have been in a lot of cities. Every city has kind of its own profile. I've seen the dead bodies. I've seen all of this massacre which Russians made in the Kiev region, in Bucha, Irpin, just injured cities, like all buildings have been destroyed. I've been maybe like in 10 cities in this trip, supporting journalists, fixing for them like...
Yes, let me try.
We have been in a lot of cities. Every city has kind of its own profile. I've seen the dead bodies. I've seen all of this massacre which Russians made in the Kiev region, in Bucha, Irpin, just injured cities, like all buildings have been destroyed. I've been maybe like in 10 cities in this trip, supporting journalists, fixing for them like all of interviews with, for example, people who all...
I mean, that adds a little bit of an element. I might need some tweaking, but also I think it's nice to have these added in, and then when you revisit it, you slowly reduce and redact and augment all the sounds that you've slowly accumulated, rather than try and make them all fit perfect, because you can often end up overcooking it. But that kind of covers today. So it was mainly focusing on like practical application of all the stuff we've been talking about, and just doing it repeatedly in context, because when you talk about it conceptually, theoretically, it sounds great, but when you go to actually doing it, you realize there are a bunch of things that don't necessarily work the way that they think that they should, or sometimes you have to do things that aren't quite normal, or change your approach because you couldn't find the right sample, get the effects to do what you wanted them to do, etc., etc. But that kind of overall is where we're at with the podcast. If there's any questions, then feel free to send me an email or send SoundBad an email with any stuff, and I can either answer in the next section or reply to your email, whichever you'd rather. And yeah, I think that's kind of everything for today. But thank you so much, and I will see you guys next week.